comments to address council. Mr. Bellfy.
Yes, you made reference to the letter that I sent you all, so we don't need to go through that again. I asked for an executive session to discuss certain problems that we're having with, I don't use the word corruption necessarily, but some of the things have to deal with Mr. McGinty and the way that the City Center 2 process has been unfolding. And all the documents that I'm referring to are on publicresponse.com, including the letter that I've sent to all of you. The reason I sent the letter to all of you, and I sent it 3 times, is because some of the communications that I've been presenting to the council have never made it into the public record. So I wanted to make sure that this particular issue, which is very, very important, is put in front of the public. And it all goes back a long, long time, as I mentioned. This process has been going on for 4 years. And I've come to this council before, and I talked about the process whereby the governor can have a hearing to remove all of you from office for a willful neglect of duty. And my suggestion in that letter was that we should have this executive session in order to perhaps preclude that option. And you all chose, and I might say that I'm very happy that you chose to do this in public. It's a testament, I guess, to your new openness policy. And we're going to have this discussion in public instead of in private. So I won't go through all of the issues. We have other people here who may go through some of the other ones, but the first one, which I've been talking about for probably close to 4 years, is eminent domain. You may not know this, you may not have seen this document, but this is a memo from Jim Van Ravensway sent to Mr. McGinty that says, and I'm only going to read a little part of it, it's pretty short at any rate, but it says, Doug want us to do the eminent domain threat thing so that he can qualify this property sale on Evergreen Road for a 1033 exchange, which is, of course, the eminent domain process. Now, that was in 2008, April 1st. In 2009, Mr. Van Ravensway wrote a letter to the State News, which they published. And again, I won't read the whole thing. But he says, as stated on numerous occasions at numerous public meetings and forums, at no time did the city ever consider, threaten, or mention the use of eminent domain to property owners or to anyone else. To say so is flatly untrue. That's a quote from Mr. Van Ravensway. This is over a year after he made this statement to Mr. McGinty. Doug wants us to do the eminent domain threat thing. And they did. They carried through that process to do the eminent domain threat thing. I also received other communication from the city dealing with the same issue. And this particular document is a memo, handwritten. I know Mr. McGinty might recognize the handwriting because it came from his office. We presume it's from him. And it says, among other things, and I have to read the transcription because it's very hard to read that. But it says, again, this 1033 exchange stuff, there was a problem with the sale of this property. There was an option agreement. There was also a management fee. Apparently, the owners of these properties were concerned that the management fee was going to be considered income, and they wanted to call it something else. They wanted to call it, roll it into the option fee, call it damages, perhaps, whatever, so they could roll that into the 1033 and avoid paying their taxes. So, Mr. McGinty was very happy to accommodate them in what I am calling tax fraud. And I have to also remind all of you that every document that's on public response and is in my possession is in the possession of the FBI and the IRS. So I'm not making this stuff up. I'm reading from documents that are provided from the city. Now, back in April of 2010, I came before this council and I talked about the sale of the property from DTN to Strathmore, 2 private entities. And I said, how come the city is issuing 1033 letters of exchange for a private land sale? And the mayor asked Tom Yaden to respond to me, and he put his response into a document, which is also posted on public response. And he says, well, yeah, Mr. Bellfy's right. There is a letter from the city manager that says that we're going to use eminent domain, but we never did because it's a private land sale. Consequently, the city did not purchase those properties. So my big question, if the city did not use eminent domain, then what are they doing issuing 1033 letters of exchange? Secondly, in that same letter, Mr. Yaden states the city had no involvement in this. There was no expenditure of city funds. Again, I want to point out, in my FOIA requests, I received the billing records. Mr. McGinty charged the city for brokering that private land deal between two private individuals. I called that billing fraud. And I have to be honest with you, the FBI seems to agree with me. Mr. McGinty has every perfect right to broker a land deal between any two people he wants. But if it's a private land deal, I don't think that he has the right to bill the city for that. Now, if this all gets to the governor's office and we have a public hearing, we can find out what the truth is. We can find out what exactly is going on with all this stuff. Other issues that I'm very concerned about was Mr. Spiridokas' property on Evergreen as well. He came before this council in 2006 and was considering the demolition of his property because he wanted to build a new apartment building there. The city council said no. Mr. Springer came before this council and said, those are perfectly good buildings. We would never consider tearing them down for new development. 2 years later, guess what happens? Mr. Springer goes before the Historic District Commission before the city owned those properties. And Mayor Loomis suggested in an email that you, the council members, authorized Mr. Van Ravensway and Mr. Springer to go before the Historic District Commission to seek the demolition of those properties that you did not own. And Mr. McGinty, of course, defended that process. And I don't know how to refer to that. It seems to be a problem of abusing the city's power of eminent domain and the Historic District Commission in order to force the Spiridokas family to sell their properties. And it worked, quite frankly. Now, another problem with this eminent domain stuff, and I know I'm going over time, but you decided to do this in public, so you're going to have to sit here and listen to me. I requested from the city documentation on all of the threats of eminent domain letters, all of the letters of 1033 exchange that were issued by the city, and Mr. McGinty's office and Mr. Staten's office, the city manager, wrote back in their response to my FOIA request, no such records exist. Zero. In the billing records, I have references to several, perhaps a dozen letters that threaten eminent domain that Mr. McGinty drafted and were sent by Mr. Staten. Now, I don't include all the ones that deal with the widening of Abbott Road. That's obviously an illegitimate use. There's another process on Bircham. I'm not exactly sure, but I think you were expanding the storm overflow catchment down there. That's a legitimate use. So I don't include any of those, and there were plenty of those. But there are many references to threats of eminent domain that seem to fall outside of the bounds that the state constitution allows the city to do. And Mr. Loomis and Nathan Triplett and Ted Staten went before the State News editorial board and defended the city's action. And Mr. Loomis was quoted as saying, at the request of the seller, we issued these letters. Those are voluntary sales. They are not eligible for 1033 letters of exchange. Go to the courts and find that out. The last thing that I want to mention is another very serious problem, and that's the building at 100 West Grand River that, according to an affidavit by Jane Medoff, says the police and fire had created extensive damage in the building through their training exercises, and the building is therefore unfit for habitation and qualifies for brownfield funding. We also have another letter, I believe from the the fire chief, that said, we didn't do any damage whatsoever. I don't know where this idea comes from. We did no damage whatsoever. So again, we have two city officials claiming two exact opposite things. Maybe when we get before the governor, we can resolve the issue and find out what the truth is on all of these issues. Thank you.
Mr. Bellfy, before you leave, I do want to address, you suggested that council declined your request to meet in executive session and chose to have this conversation here. It's my understanding that the requirements of the Open Meetings Act preclude the East Lansing City Council from adjourning into executive session to have the type of session that you have requested. We are precluded in our ability to do that. But for a legal definition, I'm going to turn it over to the city attorney so that he can, again, advise council, advise you, and advise those who are here with us tonight and watching us as to why the city council cannot adjourn into executive session as you have requested. Mr. McGinney, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, there are only a few specific exceptions to the Open Meetings Act that would allow this body to go into an executive session or a closed meeting. These are well defined in the statute. Some require a simple majority, others require a 2/3 vote. And to meet in executive session with a citizen to listen to these complaints, or allegations, I should say, is not within any of the statutory exceptions. It's beyond any of them, and therefore, as I have advised the council, we cannot do this discussion in an executive session.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so in other words, you didn't really want to do this in public, but you just couldn't do it anyway.